Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be tackling an idea that's so fundamental to philosophy. I mean, it's something that I know you as a philosopher are always engaging with. We're talking about power.
Yeah,
But, we're not going to just stay at that really high level.
right.
What we're going to do is we're going to kind of excavate how feminist thinkers have really grappled with this idea.
Exactly.
Because power, as we know, is so crucial
hmm
for thinking about critiquing gender subordination and then thinking about possible pathways to change.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because when you first look at a lot of feminist work, power is not always explicitly like the central topic.
Right.
Wendy Brown, who's a really prominent feminist theorist, even points that out, that, we often have to kind of reconstruct their views on power by looking carefully at how they address all these issues.
Right. It's not always the thing that they're writing a treatise on.
Right, exactly.
So what we're going to do in this deep dive is try to bring those feminist perspectives on power into sharper focus. So we'll be looking at three main ways that feminists have conceptualized power. Power is a resource that needs to be redistributed. Power is domination, and then power is empowerment.
Right.
But before we jump into those specifically feminist conceptions, maybe we should just touch on some of the general debates about how power is defined in social and political theory more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start.
Just to give us some context.
Right.
So as a philosopher, all these different approaches to thinking about things like power and, these things can get really complex and messy.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be tricky to kind of pin it down.
But that's why we're here.
Yeah.
So how is power generally understood in social and political theory?
Okay, well, one of the first things to remember is that the concept of power itself, I mean, even just the word power, is often what we call an essentially contested concept. So you can think of it like terms such as justice or democracy. Like, we all agree these are important, but their precise meanings, right, and how they're actually put into practice, that's often debated, sometimes pretty fiercely. Yeah, and actually, even the idea of essentially contested concepts is itself, a bit ironically, something that theorists argue about.
Right.
But I think one fundamental distinction that you see when you're looking at different theories of power is between understanding power as what we call power over, which is that ability to get others to do what you want, versus power to, which focuses on the ability or the capacity to act.
Okay, so maybe we can start with power over. What are the core elements of that idea?
Okay, so the kind of classic definition often comes from Max Weber. He defined power as the probability that one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his own will despite resistance.
Yeah.
Robert Dahl kind of echoed this view. He talked about the sort of intuitive idea that A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. And even scholars who really critique this kind of A affecting B framework, like Bachrach and Baratz and even Stephen Lukes in some of his earlier work, they kind of initially operated within this power overview. They just kind of focused on when A's will prevailed over B's interests.
Right.
And it's interesting, even Michel Foucault in his earlier writings, before he kind of moved in more complex directions, he kind of implicitly assumed this power over element was a starting point.
Right.
So yeah, that's the kind of general idea.
Okay, so it's about one person's will prevailing over another's.
Yeah.
So how is power to conceptualized?
Power to shifts the focus away from this imposition onto another person's will towards more ability, potential, capacity.
Yeah.
So you have thinkers like Thomas Hobbes who saw power as the present means to obtain some future apparent good, so the capacity to achieve an outcome. And Hannah Arendt saw power as that kind of fundamental human ability, not just to act by yourself, but to act in concert with other people.
Right.
So really focusing on that collective capacity to act. Yeah, Hannah Pitkin really points out the etymology of the term power. It comes from the French pouvoir and the Latin potere, both of which mean to be able.
Right.
And so she defines power as capacity, potential, ability. Even Lukes, later on, in his later work, kind of moved toward a more dispositional understanding of power, seeing it not just as the actual event of control, but as this underlying potentiality.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of the other side of that distinction.
Okay. So one is about the imposition, and the other one is about that inheritability.
Right.
But there's also another distinction that the source material brings up.
Yeah.
Which is action theoretical versus systemic or constitutive. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
Sure. So action theoretical conceptions, as we've kind of seen in some of those examples, Hobbes, Weber, they really focus on the actions and the abilities of individual agents.
Right.
But then systemic views look at how social systems themselves distribute power differentially, right? So they structure the possibilities for action. So you can think about like economic structures or legal frameworks that might empower certain groups while constraining others.
Yeah.
And then you have this third one, this constitutive view, which says that power isn't just something that like acts upon individuals or within systems, but it's kind of embedded in the relationships between power individuals and the social world.
Yeah.
So thinkers like Spinoza, Arendt, and Foucault in some of his work, they kind of lean towards this constitutive view. They see power as playing a role in like shaping our identities, like the fabric of social reality.
Right.
It's kind of interesting how Foucault, as his work evolved, touched on both of those. You have that action theoretical and then that constitutive.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we've kind of established that power can be a really contested term because of these different ways of defining it. But the source material also suggests there's a deeper reason for the contestation.
Yeah.
So why is it that our understanding of power is so fraught?
I think one of the reasons is, the influence of our own political and theoretical commitments. So how we define power often reflects, what we want to analyze or what we're hoping to achieve in our scholarly work.
Right.
So for instance, if you're a scholar and you're studying social movements and resistance movements, you're probably going to have a different working definition of power than somebody who's analyzing like state sovereignty.
Right.
I mean, a particular conceptualization of power becomes more or less useful depending on what your particular theoretical goals are.
Right.
But then even more radically, Stephen Lukes argued that our very conceptions of power are themselves shaped by the existing power relations.
Whoa, okay.
So in other words, how we think about power isn't neutral.
Right.
It can either reinforce the existing hierarchies or it can give us tools to challenge those hierarchies.
Right. So our very frameworks are kind of situated within these power relations that are already existing.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that our understanding of power is not objective or detached from these relations, I think this is central to a lot of feminist perspectives.
Okay.
And there's this particular argument that the historically dominant power over model might actually be a product of patriarchal social structures.
Okay, that's really fascinating. So with all of that said, let's now turn to how feminist thinkers have specifically approached this idea of power.
Okay.
And we'll start with what the source material calls power as resource.
Okay.
So what does it mean to think about power as resource for a feminist analysis?
Okay, so this perspective sees power as a social good, something that's positive in itself, but it's currently distributed unfairly along gender lines. So for liberal feminists who take this view, the goal is to kind of redistribute this resource to achieve greater gender equality. And one of the things that Iris Marion Young points out when she's writing about this is that there's kind of an assumption here that power is like a kind of stuff, like a capital, that individuals or groups can kind of possess in varying amounts and that you can transfer it or reallocate it.
Right.
So it's kind of like thinking about it like a resource like money.
Yeah, okay, so that's the general idea. And the source material mentions Susan Waller-Auken's work, especially Justice, Gender, and the Family.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into this understanding of power as resource?
So Auken argues in that book really meticulously that the traditional family structure, the one that is kind of gender structured, leads to an unjust distribution of what she calls critical social goods.
Yep.
And the thing that's interesting is that she includes power explicitly in this category of critical social goods, along with things like income, labor, opportunities for development, prestige. So her analysis kind of implies that a key feminist objective should be to try to achieve a more equitable distribution of power within intimate relationships, families, and then kind of by extension throughout society as a whole.
Right, to make it more equitable.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Iris Marion Young also critiques this model.
Right.
This distributive model of power. So what are her main kind of criticisms there?
Yeah. So she actually raises several really fundamental objections that challenge the foundations of that distributive model. So first, she says that power isn't like a static thing, like a stuff that you can possess and redistribute like you would like, material goods.
Okay.
But it's actually more of a dynamic social relation.
Okay.
And then second, she says this model tends to focus too narrowly on just individual, like two people, like husband and wife relationships.
Okay.
So this dyadic, what we call a dyadic relationship. And as a result, it kind of overlooks the broader, like the systemic social context, the institutional, the structural context that shape power dynamics.
Yeah.
So that kind of narrow focus, she says, makes it difficult to really understand how pervasive and how entrenched these forms of domination are. And then third, the distributive model kind of sees power as like a fixed pattern of allocation, right? Like at a
Yeah.
given moment in time, this person has this much power and this person has this much power. But Young, she draws on the work of Foucault, and she
Yeah.
says that power is actually dynamic, and it exists only in its exercise, so in these ongoing processes and interactions.
Yeah.
And then finally, she says that this model kind of often equates domination with simply concentrating power, right? Like in the hands of a few.
Right.
But Young argues that this doesn't really fully explain domination, especially in contemporary societies like the ones that we live in now, industrial societies where power is often really dispersed and diffused, right, through social mechanisms and through institutions.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. So that critique really sets us up to think about the next conceptualization,
Yeah,
which is power as domination.
right.
And this one sounds way more critical of how power operates.
Yeah, exactly. So rather than seeing power as this neutral resource, that can be unfairly allocated, it sees power primarily as a relation of domination. And that's understood as that kind of unjust, illegitimate, or harmful exercise of power over.
Okay.
And feminist theorists who use this lens use a lot of different terms: oppression, patriarchy, subjection. But the central idea is really about how power over is used to create and to maintain inequalities and subordination. And there are a lot of different philosophical approaches within this broad understanding.
Right. Okay. So let's start with the phenomenological feminist approaches.
Okay, so like a really foundational text for this is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And her analysis of women's situation is really built upon this philosophical distinction between being for itself the conscious, self-determining subject and being in itself the unreflective, immanent object.
Okay.
So Beauvoir argued that throughout history, men have overwhelmingly kind of occupied this position of subject, defining themselves as the norm and then relegating women to the status of other.
Right.
And this fundamental subjective-error dichotomy, she argued, is key to understanding gendered domination.
Okay.
And she saw women's situation as one in which their transcendence, their inherent capacity for freedom, action, and self-creation is constantly being pulled back into immanence, into that state of like passivity and objectification. So this kind of like degradation of existence, when it's imposed on women, this is what she considered an absolute evil. And she did explore this idea of bad faith, where women kind of internalize and accept this imposed otherness. But her primary focus was really on those oppressive structures that create and maintain that situation.
Okay. And that's an incredibly influential framework. However, the source material also mentions some significant criticisms of Beauvoir's approach, particularly through the lens of race.
Right.
So how do those play out?
Yeah. So a number of feminist thinkers have raised critical concerns about Beauvoir's use of analogies between gender and race, and particularly her tendency to compare the situation of women to the situation of Black people and slaves.
Okay.
So critics, like Catherine T. Gines, now Bell, argue that these comparisons can often erase the specific experiences of Black women.
Right.
So by implicitly centering whiteness within the category of woman and then maleness within the category of Black, these analogies fail to recognize the simultaneous and the intersecting effects of racism and sexism.
Right. They kind of collapse these two things together
Exactly.
when they should be distinct.
Yeah. And Bell also points out that sometimes Beauvoir uses these comparisons to argue for the primacy of gender oppression as like the fundamental form of injustice.
Okay.
And this position has been criticized for failing to acknowledge how interconnected the various forms of domination are and for kind of potentially creating this hierarchy of oppression.
Right, which is something that you really don't want to do.
Right, exactly.
So building upon Beauvoir's foundational insights, how have subsequent feminist phenomenologists further explored this concept of domination,
Right.
especially in relation to kind of the lived female body?
Right. So Iris Marion Young, she felt that while Beauvoir kind of gave us this powerful framework, she didn't adequately kind of address the role of embodiment in women's oppression. So while Beauvoir talked about women's bodies primarily in relation to this status of other, right, Young, she kind of drawing on the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty and his emphasis on the lived body, really wanted to look more carefully at how women experience and inhabit their bodies in a patriarchal society. And her famous essay, Throwing Like a Girl, kind of really illustrates how girls and women often experience and use their bodies differently than boys and men do.
Right.
Right. And she's exhibiting this tension, right, between subjective intentionality and an awareness of her body as this object of external gaze.
Right.
So Young argues that this comes from the fact that women in patriarchal cultures are positioned as both subject and object,
Right.
right, leading to this kind of like fractured or uncoordinated sense of their own physicality.
Yeah.
So that initial insight was then further kind of taken up and developed by other feminist phenomenologists, and they looked at all sorts of experiences like pregnant embodiment and, the meanings of clothing and the experience of having breasts and all these sorts of things.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of one way it's been taken up.
And there's also that point that's made in the source material that feminist phenomenology actually engages with post-structuralist critiques.
Yeah.
Particularly this charge of essentialism.
Right, exactly. So feminist phenomenologists, like Johanna Oxaler, for instance, they've actively engaged with these post-structuralist critiques, the ones by people like Foucault and Butler, who really emphasize the social construction of sex and gender.
Right.
And so what Oxala and others argue is that while acknowledging the profound influence of discourse, right, and social construction, feminist phenomenology says that lived experience is still really important.
Right.
So they're saying that while experience is always mediated and interpreted, right, through these existing social and linguistic frameworks, it's not entirely reducible to that. So
Right.
there's this gap, this kind of like space of lived immediacy that can give us a basis for questioning and resisting these oppressive power relations. So the idea is that even though our experiences are shaped by social forces, they can still give us insights into and challenges to these dominant narratives and power structures.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out,
Yeah,
that it's not just either.
right.
And it's also important to point out that the contributions of Latina feminist phenomenology have been really key.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been crucial. So Mariana Ortega, for instance, she's made a significant contribution by bringing a phenomenological lens to the work of Latina feminists like Gloria Anzaldúa and Maria Lugones.
Yeah.
And this perspective focuses on the unique lived experiences of those who inhabit what we call borderlands, both literal and metaphorical, and who navigate these states of in-betweenness.
Yeah.
And so it provides a really valuable kind of expansion of traditional phenomenological concerns by centering these experiences of marginalized selves and challenging that kind of like universality that was often assumed in earlier phenomenological accounts of subjectivity and embodiment.
Right. Okay. So that gives us a sense of that phenomenological approach to thinking about power's domination.
Yeah.
Now, what about radical feminists?
Okay.
How do they conceptualize this?
Okay, so radical feminists tend to center their analysis on these fundamental relationships, these dyadic relationships, of dominance and subordination.
Okay.
And they often kind of draw an analogy to that historical master-slave dynamic.
Okay.
So Catherine McKinnon is a central figure here.
Yeah.
And she famously argues that gender difference itself isn't just this neutral fact, but it's actually a reified effect of male domination. So she says that difference is the velvet glove on the iron fist of domination.
Right.
So for McKinnon, the categories of men and women, these are actually constituted by power, with men as the dominant group and women as the subordinate group.
Okay.
And she sees male domination as pervasive across every aspect of social life, with heterosexual intercourse actually serving as that primary paradigm for understanding that power dynamic. So this leads her to this really controversial conclusion, which is that female power within the current patriarchal structure is a contradiction in terms.
Right.
And that claim has drawn a lot of criticism because it's potentially denying women's agency and their capacity to resist.
Yeah, I see how that could be problematic. Now, Marilyn Frye also offers a distinct radical feminist perspective on power,
Yeah.
focusing on these concepts of access and then the power to define.
Yeah. So Frye, she provides a really nuanced analysis of power, and she really emphasizes this idea of access. So she defines total power as unconditional access to things. Resources, opportunities, social spaces. And then powerlessness is that unconditional accessibility, like you're readily available and vulnerable to the demands and the actions of other people.
Okay.
And so she argues that one of the key strategies for challenging male power is controlling access. And she talks about, things like feminist separatism and developing women-only spaces and networks. And then she also highlights this other thing, this power of definition. It's that ability of the dominant group to shape language, to establish norms, and to determine what's considered true or noble. So she observes that people in power have this capacity to define the very terms of discourse, right? And thereby kind of shape how reality itself is understood.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. And the last person we're going to talk about within radical feminism is Carol Pateman,
Okay.
who wrote The Sexual Contract.
Yeah.
Now, this book is also sometimes discussed under the socialist feminist perspective.
Yeah, it kind of straddles both.
But how does she conceptualize domination?
So Pateman, she argues that alongside this traditional social contract that establishes our political rights and obligations, there's also a foundational sexual contract that kind of underpins modern society.
Okay.
And she argues that this sexual contract establishes gender difference as the fundamental political difference between freedom and subjection.
Okay.
And historically and structurally, men are associated with freedom and women with subjection. And in her view, men are collectively kind of deemed good enough to be women's masters. And this sexual contract enshrines male sexual access to and dominance over women. So this leads to the creation of these, what she calls male-female master-subject dyads throughout social and political life.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And the source material mentions that Nancy Fraser actually offers a critique of this framework.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
She critiques the master-subject model, suggesting that while it captures important aspects of direct domination, it doesn't fully account for those more impersonal structural mechanisms that actually contribute to women's subordination in, like, complex contemporary societies.
Okay, so it's not nuanced enough.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really fascinating to see all of this emphasis within radical feminism itself. So now let's turn our attention to the socialist feminist approaches to understanding power as domination.
Okay.
So maybe we can just start with a general overview.
Okay. So traditionally, Marxist theory has analyzed domination mainly through that lens of class exploitation. So it's focusing on the power relations between the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, and then the proletariat, the workers, the wage laborers.
Right.
But socialist feminists in the second wave, they were really critical of this, and they said, this analysis is largely gender blind.
Yeah.
It doesn't really account for women's unpaid reproductive labor, their specific forms of oppression within the family, and the complex interplay between class and gender in shaping social inequalities.
Right.
So they argued that if you really want to have a comprehensive understanding of domination, you need to integrate a radical feminist critique of patriarchy with the Marxist analysis.
Okay.
And this led to what we call dual systems theory.
Okay.
So this theory says that there are two relatively autonomous but interacting systems of oppression: capitalism and patriarchy.
Okay.
Yeah.
However, the source material mentions that Iris Marion Young critiques this.
She does, yeah. So she later critiqued this dual systems theory because she said it often just kind of grafts gender onto an essentially unchanged Marxist framework, rather than fundamentally rethinking domination itself.
Yeah, it doesn't do enough.
Right, exactly.
And Young actually went on to develop a more comprehensive analysis with her 5 faces of oppression.
Right.
So what are those?
Okay, so Young identifies 5 kind of key faces of oppression, or we might call them dimensions of oppression.
Okay.
So the first one is exploitation.
Okay.
And this involves the transfer of the results of the labor of one social group to benefit another.
Right.
And then you have marginalization, the exclusion of certain groups from meaningful participation in social and economic life. Powerlessness, the lack of authority, status, and this kind of sense of autonomy in your work, in your social life.
Okay.
Cultural imperialism, the universalization of the dominant group's experiences and culture as like the norm.
Right.
And then finally, systematic violence, the exposure of members of a group to routine and socially sanctioned violence.
Okay.
So this framework, it gave us this much more multidimensional understanding of oppression.
Right. It moved beyond just those purely economic factors.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, Nancy Hartsock also does some really important work within the socialist feminist perspective on power. So what are her core arguments?
So Hartsock, in her book, Money, Sex, and Power, focuses on how these gendered relations of domination are historically constructed and how they are maintained.
Okay.
And she's also really critical of how these dominant, often male-centered perspectives have actually shaped our understanding of what domination is and how it operates.
Okay.
So she argues that mainstream theories of power often implicitly assume this market model, that's rooted in the experiences of the ruling class and of men.
Right.
And as a result, they kind of overlook and misrepresent women's experiences, especially this crucial role they play in what we call social reproduction, that unpaid labor of caring for families and maintaining the household.
Right.
And Hartsock, she called for this kind of radical reconceptualization of power from a specifically feminist standpoint, grounded in the lived experiences and the labor of women.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the source material also talks about the resurgence of socialist feminism
Yeah.
in the form of social reproduction theory, or SRT.
Right.
So how does this contemporary approach analyze domination?
So SRT is this contemporary Marxist feminist framework
Okay.
that builds on these earlier socialist feminist insights.
Right.
And it asks this really fundamental question. How is labor power itself produced and reproduced on a daily and generational basis?
Right. How does that happen?
Right. And SRT argues that this essential process happens mostly outside the formal, paid economy,
Okay.
through what we call social reproduction, the predominantly unpaid labor of domestic work, childcare, elder care, and just generally maintaining households and communities. And this has been historically and disproportionately performed by women.
Yeah.
And thinkers like Silvia Federici see this as an ongoing process of what they call expropriation, where the value created through social reproduction is essential for capitalist accumulation, but it goes largely unacknowledged and it's unpaid.
Right.
So SRT really emphasizes that production in the formal economy and reproduction in the social sphere, they're not separate and independent.
Right.
They're actually deeply integrated and interdependent parts of a single capitalist system.
Yeah. So it's getting at these fundamental inequalities in a really important way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's move on to intersectional approaches to understanding power as domination
Okay.
and how they kind of get at the complexity of this.
Okay, so intersectionality, it kind of offers this critical lens that focuses on the complex, the interconnected, and the overlapping nature of different forms of domination and inequality.
Yeah.
So it looks at sexism, racism, class oppression, heterosexism, ableism, and others.
Right.
And it says that these systems of power are not separate and they don't just add up, they actually interact in these really complex ways
All right.
to create these really unique experiences of oppression and of privilege. Right, and this depends on an individual's or a group's multiple social identities.
Right.
Now, the term itself is relatively recent, but the roots of this kind of intersectional thinking, they actually lie in Black feminist thought. And you see some of these early, what we call proto-intersectional analyses by late 19th and early 20th century Black feminists.
Yeah.
And they recognize and they actively fought against these intertwined systems of racism and sexism.
Right.
So you have people like Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells and Sojourner Truth. And later, the Combahee River Collective and thinkers like Audre Lorde and Angela Davis and Bell Hooks, they further kind of developed these ideas and highlighted this idea of interlocking systems of oppression.
Right.
And Kimberly Crenshaw, she's the one who really kind of popularized this term intersectionality.
Yeah.
Her work was really influential, particularly her critique of single-axis frameworks in anti-discrimination law. So these laws don't often capture the lived realities of people who are facing multiple and intersecting forms of subordination. So, a good example of this is, Black women facing both race and gender discrimination.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of the general idea.
And intersectionality is a really, a huge, really a dominant framework in a lot of different fields.
Right, yeah.
But it's also faced some critique.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some of the main philosophical concerns that have been raised about intersectionality?
Okay, so one of the criticisms is that while intersectionality is really good at kind of illuminating the experiences of individuals, who face these multiple forms of oppression, at that kind of like micro or individual level, sometimes it lacks a corresponding macro level concept.
Right.
That would help us analyze those overarching structures and systems that actually produce these intersecting inequalities. So Patricia Hill Collins, with her work on interlocking systems of oppression, tries to kind of address this.
Okay.
Another critique is that it overemphasizes oppression. And it doesn't really pay enough attention to the role of privilege, right?
Yeah.
And how privilege intersects with marginalized identities. And Jennifer Nash, she kind of raises this important question about whether all identities are intersectional.
Right.
Or if it really just applies to those marginalized identities.
Right.
And Anne Gary actually kind of responds to that by proposing a broader understanding that includes both axes of privilege and oppression.
Okay. Yeah. So more nuanced.
Right.
So more nuanced.
Yeah.
What other critiques are there?
Okay, so Naomi Zak has this concern about whether intersectionality might undermine inclusivity by kind of like fragmenting the category of women into these smaller and smaller identity groups.
Right.
And then some queer theorists like Lynn Huffer and Jesbir Poor, they've critiqued intersectionality for potentially remaining trapped within the logic of identity categories.
Okay.
So they're arguing that these categories themselves, they are products of power and social construction. And Puar, particularly, she suggests that some of these intersectional concepts might be Eurocentric and rooted in kind of colonial ways of thinking.
Okay.
And then finally, Anna Karastathius and others, they've argued that intersectionality has been too easily appropriated, and detached from its specific roots in Black and women of color feminism.
Right.
And this might be due to what some scholars call aversive racism.
Okay, so a lot of really valid concerns. And I'm assuming there have been attempts to respond to these.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, scholars have continued to refine and to expand intersectional theory in response to these concerns.